with only a few exceptions, most of you are going to go home tonight. You're going to crawl into your bed, secure, knowing that when you get up tomorrow, you can look forward to another normal day. No one's chasing you out of your home. The United States is a safe place for Jews. There's no compelling reason to flee because there's really no place else in the world where we would find a better home for ourselves. And unless you were born in Iran before 1978, or Ethiopia before 1976, or Russia before 1985, or a few other hotspots around the globe over the past couple of decades, chances are that you, like me, have gone to sleep every single night of your life knowing the very same thing. Sleep, wake, sleep, wake, sleep, wake, the same routine, waking up in the bed knowing it was a place where you could go to sleep that night. So I ask you to focus on Hashkivenu. Hashkivenu Adonai Eloheinu l'shalom v'hamidenu shomreinu l'chaim. O God, cause us to lie down in peace and wake us up to life. We can sing those words because if we were wanderers, or if our ancestors were wanderers, we found a place to wake up in the morning to safety and security. So when we sing those words, they're more personal. When we sing those words, they're an affirmation of the security that we have. We don't have to worry about war and famine and evil forces that are banging at our doors. Of course, it hasn't always been that way for our people. My own grandparents slept their last peaceful night in Germany shortly before Kristallnacht. On that night, they left my father sleeping with an Aryan babysitter, and they wandered the streets of their town. And they watched the brown shirts break windows and burn books and torch synagogues. That restless night, they swore to each other that they would bring my father to the United States so that he could once again sleep through the night peacefully. My maternal grandparents, they did sleep relatively peacefully in Russia until endless pogroms and poverty and persecution kept them awake far too many nights. So they packed their family and they headed for the Golden Medina, they called it, right? Opportunity in America. When they gave birth to my grandfather, they knew that he could sleep each night, dreaming that he could do anything he wanted to be anything he wanted to be, do anything he wanted to do in his life. And in fact, he went to college and became a dentist, and the rest is history. Here I am. That's our common story. We sleep peacefully in this country for the most part because our ancestors couldn't sleep in their original homelands. They came here, so we could. That's the Jewish story. And unless your 23andMe test shows that you have Native American blood, chances are you are a wanderer or the descendants of wanderers who found your way into this country. I'm told that mine is 90% Ashkenazi Jew. Surprise, right? But that story of refugees and wanderers, that's a story we've told since our inception as a people. And it's likely, of course, you have some familiarity with the biblical stories of immigration and wandering. I'm not going to go into detail. I talked about Abraham and Lech Lecha, this week's Torah portion. God said to him, Lech Lecha me'artzecha, leave your land. Leave your land. In other words, Abraham was born, or Abram, as he was called, was born in the land. And God said, leave your native land. Become a refugee. Life may be fine here in Ur, where you live, but check out Canaan if you really want to thrive. Wander to that strange land and reestablish your roots. And in that land, you'll become more than you'll ever be in your birthplace. That's a refugee dream, an immigrant story. And you know the story of the Israelite slaves, of course, where Moses said, run from your slavery. Get out from under the persecuting thumb of Pharaoh. Become refugees. Wander the barren wilderness. Cross borders, some friendly, some hostile. But in that new land, you'll become more than you would ever have become in your birthplace. So unless you're a biblical scholar, any biblical scholars out here? Good. Or you studied with me. Anybody study with me? Some of you have. So I'm going to tell you something you may not know. The stories of Abraham's and Sarah's wanderings, the stories of the Exodus from Egypt, they were transformed from some original version into what we now read in the Torah. Centuries after the events that they describe were said to have occurred, they were taken and reworked by later editors. Scholars suggest that our ancestors living in Babylon in 586 BCE, 2,500 years ago, it's still a long time, after their temple and their holy city were destroyed, Jerusalem was destroyed, they were exiles, they were refugees, they were wanderers. They brought the stories, the original stories of Abraham and Sarah with them, the memories of Egyptian bondage, into exile. And there, in exile, they embellished the stories that were even ancient in their time. They elaborated on Abraham's journey from Ur. Where was Ur? Ancient Babylon, the very same spot where they now lodged. They retold their stories because in those stories they were able to embody their own hopes for a return to the land. They expanded the story of the slaves leaving Egypt. They imagined throngs leaving their place of exile, going to the land because they saw it as a foreshadowing of their own possibility of leaving Babylon and returning to the land of Israel, just like those slaves did. So those revised biblical tales, they became foreshadowings, precursor stories of those Babylonian exiles, and we know they were there, and their own wandering and their return to the land. They would one day realize the Torah's promise. They would one day sleep soundly back in their land. Now, the irony of that story and of the power of that story is they didn't all leave. In fact, it wasn't until 1978 that those Babylonian exiles who embellished those stories, who elaborated on those stories of refugees and wandering and return to a land, actually had to leave. 2,500 years after that. So here's the truth for our time. We now know that our ancestors edited the Torah to emphasize the story of refugees. They framed the Jewish story as one of exile, one of wandering, one of return. And it became an enduring theme in Jewish history. So it wasn't just the story we told, it became actually a prophetic vision of what we would become. Because whether they were created in that distant past, and experienced in the words of our Torah's authors, or lived in the memories of our own grandparents, or if you're an immigrant, in each one of you, we've always longed to sleep peacefully, to be able to say the Hashkivenu and wake up in the morning, l'shalom, to peace. So I ask you, given our history, can we be anything else but champions of the world's refugees today? There are 25 million forcibly displaced people in our world. Those are people who have been not just forced out of their homes, but out of their countries. Persecution, violence, poverty, despair has driven them from their homes. There are another 40 million who are internally displaced. They've been forced out of their homes, but they still live in their own countries. That's going on in Syria right now. So this week's Torah portion, Lech Lecha, which basically says, leave your homeland, is the portion that compels us to remember our refugee story. And that's why Hayes has designated this Shabbat as Refugee Shabbat. So Hayes, having settled Jews, and it's really kind of astounding to think of the reality of Jews in our world today, there's not a Jewish community presently in need of resettlement. They've decided to advocate for the safety of those millions of refugees because we are a people who have a refugee narrative that's our eternal story. But here's the sad truth. Once, this country was a safe haven for millions. Now the quota has been further reduced from 50,000 to 45,000 immigrants a year. That's a bit more than 0.1% of our population. Now, just by comparison, Uganda has taken in 1.4 million people. That's 3% of its population. Germany, famously, and not without discord, has absorbed nearly 700,000 people. That's about 1% of Germany's population. And now we're told we don't even have room for 2,000 Guatemalans. Guatemalans who have been forced out of their homes by what? By violence, by poverty, by persecution, the same things that drove us out of our homes. Honduras has now been threatened with a cutoff of American aid if they so much as allow them to pass through. And we hear now once again the threat of family separations as a deterrent. let's be clear. Most refugees are not criminals. Most refugees are victims of criminals. And like our own ancestors, they're seeking haven. They're seeking a place to sleep through the night. What will our nation's legacy be? How will we ensure that we who tell and retell the story of our own wanderings will not be complicit in the suffering of the world's displaced? There might be those in our own Jewish community, and there are, who endorse turning their backs on the world's refugees. But I want to be clear. When they do, they are also turning their backs on Judaism's central narrative. The narrative that we created, the narrative that we lived, and the empathy and compassion that that narrative demands of us. I will not turn my back on my people's story, and I urge you to stand with me and countless others who are appalled at our nation's failure to welcome the dispossessed of the world. We must raise our voices and our votes so that the U.S. implements humane immigration policies. We must offer our support to organizations around the world who help refugees. We must continue to shop that shipping container outside for the Syrian children. We shipped one last year, we're going to ship 2 this year. We already filled one with 59,000 items of clothing that was donated by a member of this congregation, and we're going to fill that one too. We must reject hate. We must refuse to surrender to complacency, refuse to succumb to cynicism, resist the proclivity to be fearful of the other, and reject the false narratives about the dangers posed by these people. They are us. And most importantly, we must proudly and loudly declare that we care and we will act because we are Jews and because the refugee story is our story.